Let's just dive right into a really tough question, one that kind of hangs over the literary world. Why do so many writers, these people who master language to help us understand life, so often choose to end their own?
Before we go any further, we have to get one thing straight. Death by suicide is never, ever simple. It's just incredibly complex. And when it happens, whether it's someone we know or just someone we admire from a distance, it leaves behind this wake of questions.
Now here's something you might find surprising. We have this idea, probably because of the media, that famous people are more at risk. But if you actually look at the statistics, that's not true. For the most part, being famous doesn't put you at a higher risk. In fact, it's often the other way around.
But there is one glaring exception to that rule. One group where the rates of depression and suicide are alarmingly high. And that group is writers. So what is it about them? What makes this specific creative profession so vulnerable? That's the real mystery we're trying to unpack here.
To really get a handle on this, let's put some basis to the statistics. Because these aren't just numbers, right? They're real people with unfinished stories.
I mean, think about Ernest Hemingway, a Nobel laureate, a true giant of American literature. He battled severe depression for years, even went through electroshock therapy that he said erased his memory. And then, at 61 years old, he ended his own life with a hunting rifle.
Or Virginia Woolf, one of the most brilliant minds of modernism. She walked to a river near her home, filled her coat pockets with stones to weigh herself down, and just walked into the water.
And then there's the absolutely heartbreaking story of Sylvia Plath. After a really painful split from her husband and a history of previous attempts, she took her own life in her kitchen. She was only 30. And honestly, this is just a handful of names from a list that is tragically long.
So, what is going on here on a deeper psychological level? Well, to understand that final physical act, many psychologists say you have to understand the death that happens inside long before.
It's a concept they call psychological suicide. It's the state where, essentially, the mind just gives up. The world loses its color, its meaning, its importance. Everything just becomes gray. The body is still moving, but the spirit, the will to live, it's already gone. And that internal death can set the stage for the physical one.
Okay, so what could possibly trigger something so profound? Research seems to point to two main factors. The first is this overwhelming feeling of being a burden to other people. And the second, which is often a really powerful trigger, is losing something that was your foundation. Maybe it's a belief system that completely falls apart, or the death of a person who was your whole world. It just leaves this void that feels impossible to ever fill.
So, let's connect the dots here. How do these psychological triggers find such fertile ground in the world of a writer? How does the very thing that makes them a genius, their pen, also become a kind of curse?
Well, think about what the life of a writer actually looks like. It's often defined by intense isolation, just hours and hours alone with nothing but your own thoughts. It requires deep, relentless introspection, and their job is often to dive into the darkest parts of the human experience. All of that demands a high level of emotional sensitivity, and that same sensitivity that makes their art so powerful also makes them incredibly vulnerable. Add to that the higher risk of substance abuse to cope with it all, and you have a perfect storm.
There's a literary critic, Norman Holland, who had a really interesting take on this. He said we shouldn't just see a writer's work as pure fiction. He argued that if you read closely, between the lines, you can actually find the fingerprints of the author's own fears and their own struggles. The page, in a way, becomes a confession.
And you know, this whole struggle, it goes beyond psychology. This is a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries, staring right into that abyss and asking, what does it all mean?
Just look at the difference in how two massive thinkers, Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud, saw it. For Nietzsche, the choice to end one's life was like the ultimate act of freedom. He saw it as brave, but also weirdly as a sign of weakness, like he'd been defeated by life. But Freud, coming from a clinical perspective, saw it totally differently. For him, it wasn't about freedom at all. It was a symptom of deep depression, of anger that gets turned inward. It was just a sign of deep, unresolved pain.
But then you have this really powerful counterargument from someone like Albert Camus. He basically said, yeah, life is absurd, it's painful, so what? For him, the answer wasn't despair. The answer was to rebel, to accept the absurdity and live anyway, in spite of the wounds. For Camus, choosing to live was the only real philosophical victory. Suicide was never justified.
And here's where it gets even more complicated. This link between writing and suicide, it's not just about the writer. It's also about the reader.
because words have this incredible power that can be both beautiful and, well, dangerous. To see what I mean, we've got to look at one of the most famous historical case studies there is, a novel by Goethe called The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Now, you have to understand, when this book came out in 1774, it was a massive sensation. It's about a young artist who falls into a hopeless love and ends up taking his own life. And what made it so powerful was just how real it felt. For maybe the first time ever, people were reading about depression and loneliness with this raw, emotional honesty.
And the result was absolutely shocking. All across Europe, young men who saw themselves in Werther started dressing like him, talking like him, and, tragically, dying like him. It set off this wave of copycat suicides that became known as the Werther epidemic. It's a phenomenon we still call the Werther effect today, and it's just this stark reminder of how deeply literature can impact real life.
So all of this brings us right back to where we started. Is there some kind of unbreakable bond between great creativity and great suffering? Is the very sensitivity that lets a writer build these incredible worlds on a page the same thing that makes it too painful to live in the real one?
At the end of the day, the stories are complex, and we can debate the link between art and pain forever, but the pain itself is very, very real. So if any of this has felt familiar to you, if you're struggling with these kinds of thoughts, please just know that help is out there. You are not alone, and reaching out is always a sign of strength.